paano nga ba ina-assess in the classroom? Okay, paano na-assess yung students? So, in assessment of student learning, there are different types or different ways to assess. And here is that you can assess the students through various processes and measures appropriate to and congruent with the learning competencies defined by the K-12 curriculum, the CUSA, or the knowledge, understanding, skills, and attitude. Some of the processes are used for both summative or formative and summative assessment, and learners can be assessed individually and collaboratively. Okay? Using different types of assessment method, pwede mong i-assess yung students by ways of individually and collaboratively. In terms of individually, you can give quizzes, individual po yung quizzes, or examinations, it is also individually. And when talking about collaboratively, this can be about the performance task, the activities, and etc. Okay? Ito magandang pag-usapan. Let's discuss the assessment for assessment as assessment of learning. Okay. Let's start about the assessment for learning. Lagi mong tatandaan kapag assessment for learning, for formative assessment, for formative assessment. So, the teacher utilized formative assessment in order to gain an understanding of their students' knowledge and skills in order to guide instruction. So, yung assessment for learning happens before and during the discussion. So, ito yung mga ginagamit ni teacher. So, ano ba yung kasama ni assessment for learning? So, during the assessment for learning, this is the lesson proper or the discussions with the teacher kung saan nagaganap na yung mismong teaching learning process. Ito yung tinatawag nating assessment for learning. Okay po? Assessment for learning, formative assessment. Next, we have, pahuli na natin sa assessment as learning. Let's focus on assessment of learning. So, in assessment for, this happens before and during discussion. The assessment of learning, tandaan mo yung word na of course tapos na, of course ending, of course uwian na. Charot, di pa tapos doon. So, in assessment of learning or of course ending, of course tapos na, this happens at the end of the instruction or after the instruction. Paano to? So, in assessment of learning or in assessment of learning, dito, it is about reporting the progress of the students. So this is just about giving examinations to the students, giving your summative exams, long quizzes, and etc. So, kung yung assessment for learning happens before or during discussion, pwede dun yung mga activities and then performance tasks. But in assessment of learning, this is about summative assessment or you have to grade the students. Okay, nandito mo nag-gradean yung mga bata. Next, lastly is that assessment as learning. So, tandaan mo kung si assessment of learning ay of course ending, of course tapos na. Si assessment as learning naman is about focuses on students, teaching students the metacognitive process to evaluate their own learning and make adjustments. Okay, ito yung assessment as learning as self-evaluation. Okay, paano po sinasabing as self-evaluation? Okay, the teacher should teach the students to think about their own learning. Okay? Hindi mo na hawak yung pag-iisip ng bata as a teacher. So, what you have to do in assessment as learning, wala pong process to na tatawagin natin na, for example, nasa dulo, nasa gitna, or etc. Okay? In assessment as learning, self-evaluation. How the students cope up with the discussions of the teacher. Every students differ to each other, meaning to say magkakaiba yan ng magkakaiba sila ng process ng pag-intindi doon sa discussion ni teacher. Again, pag sinabi naman natin metacognitive, this is about thinking thinking. Thinking beyond thinking. Okay, ibig sabihin, tuturuan mo yung bata mag-isip na para sa kanilang sarili. So, even as a teacher, assessment as learning, syempre, si students ay nag-a-adjust, but also teachers should adjust. Okay po? So, in assessment as learning, tuturuan again yung bata na aralin or make adjustment to his self. Kasi kunyari, hindi niya naman ganun kagusto yung teacher or hindi niya ganun kagusto yung pagtuturo ng teacher. As a student, you must be able to adjust to your teachers, di ba? Kasi nga, hindi naman hawak ni teacher yung mga isipan ng bata. Again po, assessment for learning, formative assessment. Assessment for learning, formative assessment. For learning, nasa bago at during mismo nung discussions. And assessment of learning, of course, and deep, of course, tapos na, of course, nagpapa-quiz, nagpapa-long quiz na si ma'am, nagpapa-exam na si ma'am at sir. And next is assessment as learning, as self-evaluation. As self-evaluation. Okay? So, next is that we have types of assessment. Ano ba yung mga types of assessment? Okay? Okay, we have types of assessment. So, number one is placement assessment, or first, yung placement assessment is concerned with the entry performance of the students, and the purpose of placement evaluation is to determine the prerequisite skills, degree of mastery of the course, objectives, and best mode of learning. So, the placement assessment knows what level the students is. Okay, inaalam doon kung ano na ba yung mga natutunan niya from his previous years of learning, yung mga prerequisites na dapat meron na siya, and kung ano ba yung the best mode of learning na dapat doon siya mailagay. Okay? We have diagnostic assessment. So, diagnostic assessment, a type of assessment given before instruction. Ibig sabihin, this was being given at the first or before, ano ba tawag dito? At the very beginning of the whole year or the academic year. So, in diagnostic assessments, as a teacher, we identify the strengths and weaknesses of the students regarding the topics to be discussed. Okay? So diagnostic and placement is almost the same. Ang pinagkaiba lang ni placement, kung ano na ba yung mga natutunan ng isang estudyante. Giving the examples of placement assessment, so you have your qualifying exam, entrance exam, or national achievement test. Placement test is also is a type of placement test. So, in terms naman of diagnostic assessment, we have the diagnostic test. Bakit kasama yung diagnostic test? So, hinahanap natin sa diagnostic assessment yung strengths and weaknesses. So, bakit kailangan siya? So, the main purpose of diagnostic assessment is first is to identify the level of competence of the students. So, hanggang saan na yung kaya ng bata. So, right now, in our education system, ito yung mahirap. Okay? Even we have a diagnostic assessment, hindi pa ganun kagaling yung bata magsulat, magbasa, ipapasa na. So, ang ending, teachers from higher grades sometimes suffer from those types of mga gawain. Kasi nga, pinapasa na lang minsan yung bata. Okay, and then we diagnose as a teacher. We diagnose the students. Okay? Paano natin na-diagnose yung students? Di ba? Kasi, the students have problem. And sometimes, hindi pa dapat sila belong doon sa level na yun. For example, dapat pang grade 7 lang. But then, ayun na, wala tayong magagawa, pinasa, nasa pang grade 8 na. So, the teacher from that level would adjust his teachings na babalik muna ulit na basic for the students na medyo makasabay doon sa discussion. And next, we have identify the students who have already knowledge about the lessons. Okay. So, the diagnostic assessment, syempre na-assess na natin, na-diagnose natin na alam niya na pala itong may ibang bagay na to. So, as a teacher, hindi na tayo mag-focus masyado doon and bagkos papahapyawan na lang kapag halos alam na ng mga estudyante. But, hindi ko po sinasabi na pag alam ng estudyante, hindi mo i-discuss. No. You as a teacher or we as a teacher should discuss every lessons, kahit sabihin pa natin, meron ng background yung isang estudyante. Next is to determine causes of learning problems and formulate a plan for remedial actions. Okay. Okay, to determine the causes of learning problems. Ano ba yung mga learning problems ng estudyante? Now, let's say nagbigay ka ng activity sa bata. You give -2 plus 4. Ang sinagot ng bata, okay? Ang sinagot ng bata ay -6. Okay, bakit -6 yung sinagot ng bata? -2 plus 4 kasi. Adi negative tapos 6, 2 plus 4, tapos copying signs. We know the student is wrong sa answer niyang yon. But then, hindi mo alam kung bakit nagkamali yung bata. Ano ba yung alam niyang tama? Okay? We as a teacher, hindi mo sabihin sa bata, ang tanga-tanga mo talaga, ang bobo-bobo mo, -2 plus 4 na lang, mali pa sagot mo. Now, the students may have his own reasons kung bakit niya sinagot yung gano'ng -6, yung gano'ng sagot. But you as a teacher, ask the students, address the problems of the students. Okay, anak, bakit ganito yung sagot mo? Okay, ma'am kasi po, ito yung sagot ng bata, ma'am kasi po, -2 po, tapos dinagdagan ng 4, di ang sagot ko ay -6. Okay? But we as a teacher, alam mo mali. Okay, you have to correct the child. Okay? Anak, ganito kasi yan. Kapag magkaiba ng sign, di ba, negative tapos positive yung isa, kasi 4, ang gagawin mo ay pagmaminusin mo sila, tapos copy mo yung sign ng malaking number. Okay? Alin ba yung malaking number sa dalawa? Yung 4, ma'am. Okay, alin yung maliit? Yung -2 po. Okay, pag minusin mo, 4 minus 2. Okay, ang sagot ay 2. Meaning to say, anak, ang tamang sagot ay 2, hindi -6. Ganun po pala yun. Now, because you address the problems, dun ka palang makakapag-isip ng remedial. Hindi ka pwedeng mag-remedial agad nang hindi mo din alam kung alin yung problem na aayusin mo. Okay? So, that is the purpose of diagnostic assessment. So, we have formative assessment. Ano nga ulit? Pag sinabi kong formative assessment, this is also about assessment for learning. So, this is a type of assessment used to monitor the learning progress of the students during or after instruction. Okay po. So, yung formative assessment, okay, these records monitor the learning progress of the students. Kaya nga, not all, again, tandaan, formative assessment is not, it is recorded but not included in the grade computation. Why? The students is still lack of mastery of the lesson kasi nga kakadiscuss mo lang doon sa formative assessment. But it is recorded to monitor the progress of the students. Nag-i-improve ba yung bata? May maganda ba yung nagiging resulta ng learning na meron siya? So, that's the purpose of formative assessment. Okay? So, purpose of formative assessment, number 1 is to provide feedback immediately to both students and teacher regarding the success and failure of learning. Okay? Ano ba yung feedback na sinasabi dito? Okay? Yung formative assessment, yung makakapagbigay ng feedback kung yung students ay talagang natuto o hindi. So, in teacher's part naman, alam mo na kapag mababa yung resulta ng grades ng mga estudyante mo, there's something wrong with your teaching strategies. Why? Siyempre, ang daming bumagsak sa estudyante mo eh. You cannot just blame the students because hindi sila nakapag-aral ng gusto. Okay? Sabi nga, the teaching strategies is good if half of or almost 3/4 of the students get the lessons or understand the lessons. But if it's 50-50, medyo alanganin pa. So, you have to think as a teacher that if the students fails, your teaching strategies also fails. It's connected to each other. Na kapag maganda yung outcome ng grades ng student, it also means that your teaching strategies or your teaching is okay. But not at all times na kapag maganda yung grades ng bata, maganda yung teaching mo. Why? As a teacher, sometimes there are some teachers that adjust the grades of the students. Okay, there are some teachers na mataas lang magbigay ng grades kahit mababa na yung nakukuha ng bata. So again, mataas na grades doesn't mean na mas maganda yung teaching na binibigay ng teacher. Okay? So ayun yung feedback. Now, sometimes then, we have to, number 2, to identify the learning errors that is need of correction. Yun yung word. So, informative assessment, hindi naman palaging tama. Okay? Hindi palaging tama. There are still errors or learning errors na kailangan nating i-address. And we have to fix that error. Kaya nga tayo dun sa formative assessment or the whole teaching learning process na gaganap, may kita na natin kung alin yung dapat itama, alin yung mali na dapat nang iwasan. Okay? And number 3, to provide information to the teacher for modifying instruction and used improving learning and instruction. Okay? So, informative assessment, we as a teacher, you know that if may mali na doon, okay, you have to modify your instructions. Okay? Let me give you an example. There are one sections na sobrang passive. At there are also one sections na sobrang active. Okay? So, you have to adjust your instruction. Hindi pwedeng pare-pareho yun because every student is different. Now, hindi na gana sa kanila yung gantong teaching strategies. Okay? If your teaching strategies, okay, meron kang teaching strategies na hindi nagigets ng bata, you have to change, you have to adjust as a teacher. Bakit po kailangan mag-adjust? Teacher naman tayo sila mag-adjust. No. Hindi ka na maintindihan ng estudyante mo eh. Kasi yung teaching strategies mo ay hindi nila or hindi angkop para sa kanila. So, if mahilig sila sa laro, then isama mo sa laro yung teaching strategies mo. As long as there is always a learning. Okay? As a teacher, you have to improve your own learning also. Hindi ka basta-basta magtuturo lang. Okay? Bakit ko sinasabi? Na when you graduated or when you graduate and you became a teacher, baka kasi bida-bida ka palagi. You are a teacher. We are a teacher, kaya dapat yung masunod. No, there are times that you have to adjust yourself also to be fitted to the needs of the students. Okay, next we have summative assessment. Okay po, kung yung, again, summative assessment is also called assessment of learning. Okay, summative assessment of learning. So this is a type of assessment usually given at the end of a course unit. And the purpose of assessment is that, okay, pag sinabi pong summative assessment, sinabi ko na kanina na nangyayari to sa dulo. Okay, at the end of the discussion or at the end of the lesson. Kada chapter, example is the chapter test, long quiz, okay, examinations, first quarter exam, second quarter, prelim, midterm, finals. That is an example of summative assessment. So, ano ba yung purpose niya? Number 1 is to determine the extent to which instructional objectives have been met. So, we as a teachers, Na-cope up ba, na-discuss ba yung lahat na nasa objectives, na-met mo ba yung objectives na binigay mo? Okay, that's the purpose of summative assessment. And number 2 is to certify students' mastery of the intended outcome and use assigning of grades. Okay po? So, summative assessment certify the mastery. Okay, and it is used to assigning of grades. Ano ba yung sinasabi ko kanina? Na yung summative assessment, yung mga resulta ng exams, ay yun yung pinasama na sa grades. Hindi po yung kagaya ng formative assessment na recorded but not included kasi nga the students doesn't have the mastery of the lessons. Okay? And next, we have to provide information for judging appropriateness of the instructional objectives. Okay. Bakit kailangan i-judge yung pagiging angkop ng iyong instructional objective? Now, everything everything is related to objectives. You know, if your objectives doesn't met, excuse me. Okay, if your objectives in the first place doesn't met the criteria that you set or the objective that you set on the first or on the beginning of the lessons, you have to know tama ba yung appropriate ng objectiveness mo. Kasi sometimes you put objectives even na hindi mo naman madidiscuss yung lesson na yun. Okay? So, you put objectives that is not appropriate. Paano ko sinabing appropriate? Diba? Pag sinabi kasing objectives, you have your SMART. You have the specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time-bounded. Okay? So, naglalagay ka ng mga objectives na sometimes hindi na appropriate. You have to know when your objectives is appropriate. You have to know when your objectives can be met at the end of the lessons. You have to know when is it measurable or not. Okay po? So, malalaman mong appropriate siya if pasok siya doon sa criteria na pagiging smart. Okay, next we have number 4, to determine the effectiveness of instruction. Ito na. To determine the effectiveness of instructions, ano to? Bakit may ganito? Okay, paano? Now, to determine the effectiveness of instruction, meaning to say we as a teacher, that's do we discuss the lesson, do we tackle the lessons well for the student? Does the student cope up with our teaching strategies? Okay po, paano natin malalaman yon? If the students can be able to participate with your discussions as a teacher, then your instruction is effective. Okay? Pero hindi palagi porket nakikisabay sila effective na agad. Why? So, we can also say that it is effective or it has effectiveness if the grade of the students or if the results of the teaching, the results of the assessment at the end of the lessons is good. Okay po? Meaning to say, pumapasa yung mga estudyante. Na, ibig sabihin kasi nun, kapag pumasa yung estudyante mo, your instruction during the class discussion is nakuha ng mga bata. Okay? That's the purpose of summative assessment.